All right, let's go ahead and get started. A little bit of housekeeping before we start. Feel free to use that Q&A function throughout to ask any questions you have. I'm more than willing to take questions throughout, and I can also spend some time at the end answering any questions. I also have a bunch of different parts with me here today. I'll be talking about throughout the webinar a bunch of different tools. So feel free to be looking at both the slides as well as, my camera here as I'm showing off different tools that I'm talking about. But today we're going to be talking about accelerating product development with metal 3D printed tooling. A quick agenda for today. We'll start by talking about traditional methods of product development and some of the challenges there of validating both the product as well as the manufacturing process. We'll talk about, of course, how metal 3D printing can help alleviate some of these challenges to help accelerate your product development. We'll look at a bunch of different case studies from a variety of different customers who are actually doing this, who are using metal 3D printing to help them accelerate product development. And of course, I'll answer any questions you have both throughout and at the end of the webinar. So when we talk about product development process, generally we see it in two different ways. In the beginning, certainly during that design stage and some of the very, very early prototyping stages, it moves very, very, very quickly. Through modern CAD and simulation and assembly processes, as well as plastic 3D printing, you're able to come up with new designs and actually see those designs in a couple of hours, allowing you to move very, very quickly through those early design stages and get you to a product that you feel pretty comfortable with, a product that you like, and that maybe you're ready to move on to the next stage of the product development process and actually start to validate not just the design of the part, but the actual function of the part. That's generally where we see things start to really, really slow down. When you actually need to validate the function of the component and not just the design that you're able to do in CAD and 3D printing. At this stage, generally, you need these end-use materials. You need the actual material that's going to be used for that part, which generally is not available with plastic 3D printing. And then also you want to kind of start to look at the production representative manufacturing process because, of course, a plastic 3D printed part is going to perform very, very differently to an injection molded part or a machine component. We find that this is especially challenging for some of the more highly regulated industries. And when you're using some of these highly engineered resins, like a PEEK or a glass filled material, working in these industries like medical device, auto, aero, food and beverage, et cetera, that require you to do some trials and product validation, that these kind of process validation and the validation of the function of your part is especially slow and challenging when those criteria are involved. So as we just talked about, this is kind of another way of looking at what we were just talking about. And then, of course, we'll talk about what this process looks like with metal 3D printing. In the beginning, you're working in CAD, you're moving very, very fast. You're designing very, very quickly. You're assembling, you're simulating, you're doing interference detection to make sure that everything's fitting together. In that same day, you could have a plastic part in your hands to make sure that the form and fit is correct. But of course, at this stage, that material representation is pretty terrible. I've never really found a plastic material that someone has told me is an exact representation of a molded ABS or a molded polycarbonate or some material that you're actually going to go to production with. Those parts are generally not usable for certification if you do need to do any level of certification, and they're doing nothing to validate your actual manufacturing process. So you're learning nothing at that stage about what that part's going to do and how it's going to be made at the end of the process. But of course, you're going to do some cycles in this stage, get to a design that you like. This could take days, weeks, months, years, depending on what the product is. But this part of the stage is pretty well developed and works pretty well. After that, of course, now we need to start looking at how we're going to validate the function of the component. You have a couple of different options here that we hear. You could go with machining. You could machine your plastic part depending on of what that application is and what the part looks like. Generally, that can be very fast. You can have a part in a day or two, depending on the lead times of your tools, of your machine shops. It's not going to be a perfect material representation because it wasn't processed in the same way as the final injection molded part was. We especially hear that being the case with things like glass filled components where you may be cutting fibers with your cutting tools, as well as the flowability of those fibers may be different. So you're not getting a perfect material representation, but much better than plastic 3D printing. Those parts are not going to be usable for certification because they had a different manufacturing process, and you're doing nothing to validate your actual manufacturing process at this stage. You could do something like a prototype tool, an aluminum tool. It's a bit slower than machining, but you are getting a much better material representation because it was a molding process. Those parts are still generally not usable for certification, depending on the industry, because it was made out of an aluminum tool, and you're not doing much to validate the actual end-use material, end-use manufacturing process. But you are able to validate some of the actual moldability of the part and the function of the part at that stage as well. We also hear a lot of people using prototype services, something like a Protolabs or a Xometry, to get your molded parts very, very quickly, a week or two, which is great. Again, a better material representation, but generally not usable for certification, and it's not validating your actual end use material process. So this is generally looking at weeks and months. After you're kind of locked in on your function, you're happy with your part design and the function of the material. Now we need to actually move to validating the manufacturing process and the end use process, and we're moving into our steel tooling stage. Again, this is going to be now very, very slow because we're waiting for steel tools, which generally have much, much longer lead times than something like an aluminum tool or a machine part or a prototyping service. But you're going to get that perfect material representation. It's going to be usable for that certification. It's going to be usable for verification, and you're doing a lot to validate the process here because you're ensuring that your part, you're using tools that are going to be an exact representation of what you're actually going to end up going to production with. So generally that process is looking like a month. Wouldn't it be great if you could use those steel tools and get all those benefits we just talked about, them being perfect material representations, being usable for certification, allowing you to validate your actual end use manufacturing process far, far earlier, maybe even right after you're doing plastic 3D printing. You'd be able to validate that manufacturing process, validate that the mold is functioning. You're able to actually optimize your molding parameters as well, things like temperatures, pressures, cooling rates, shrink rates. You're doing some dimensional analysis on your part as well after this process because you're able to see you're using your end-use tooling material, so you're able to learn a lot more about the dimensions. And then, of course, you're just kind of just de-risking all of production at this stage because you're actually using something that's much, much more similar to what you're going to go to volume production with. So wouldn't it be great if everyone just used steel tooling, much, much earlier on in the process? But, if this is so great, why do people not do this? Why are people not using steel tools immediately after their plastic 3D printing? Why do they do these prototyping services and things like that? Of course, because I'm sure many of you know that have worked with tooling before, there's a lot of challenges associated with steel tooling. Very long lead times. We're always hearing 12 weeks, 6 months, even longer to get steel tools, just because of how difficult they are to process and how specialized the skill set is to do that. Expensive, tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars to produce these tools that if you're not, exactly honed in on your design and you're not sure that this is the right tool to build, you're not going to want to spend that money to build a tool that's not going to be able to be used for production. Generally very, very hard to produce in-house when we talk to OEMs. It's not easy to start building steel tools. You need a lot of highly skilled labor. It's going to take years to train tool makers and bring on tool makers. And you need a lot of high CapEx equipment, milling equipment, EDM equipment, grinding equipment to actually start building these tools in-house. So all of these challenges kind of involved has made it relatively rare to use steel tooling during product development unless very, very necessary. And we'll look at some of those situations where it is necessary and what those lead times kind of look like, especially when you're using those highly engineered resins or you're in one of those highly regulated industries like medical device or something where you need to be using a production representative tool. This is kind of where I'm going to introduce Mantle. Mantle, of course, if you're familiar with us, our goal at Mantle is to automate your tool making process. We do that by printing precision tool steel components with unmatched accuracy, surface finish, and material performance that are going to eliminate the time and cost of operations like programming, rough milling, and EDM that are generally required with tool building. We love to say that we are the only 3D printer that's built specifically for tool making. It's the only application we do. All we do all day long is print tools. So where Mantle kind of fits into this equation is Mantle can produce steel tools in that functional and process validation stage. We can do that at the same or similar speed to what you can do with prototype tooling or some of those prototype services. You're going to get a prototype similar cost, so you're not adding a lot of costs, but you're getting that perfect material representation. The parts are usable for certification, and we're able to validate that process as well. So being able to use steel tools much, much earlier on in the stage because you're printing those tools in H13 tool steel or P20 tool steel or 420 stainless steel, which is going to be the same material as your end-use tool much, much earlier on in the process, of course, in less time and less cost. So it can allow you to kind of move that entire steel tooling process much, much earlier on into the development stage to allow you to actually prototype or develop your part in a steel tool, which leads to a lot of different learnings that we'll explore throughout the rest of this webinar here. Today we have two tool steels available. A P20 material, which is we actually call it P2X. It's very, very similar to a P20 material. It actually has superior corrosion resistance that comes out of our process with a 32 HRC. And then we have an H13 tool steel, which is actually our more popular material. Comes out of the furnace at a 42 HRC and can be heat treated all the way up into the 50s. Both of these, I should note, are fully compatible with traditional finishing because we like to say our process gets you anywhere from 50 to 75 to 95% of the way there. Generally, tools need a little bit of grinding or wire EDM for ejector pins and things like that just to touch them up. So, of course, we're going to look at a bunch of different case studies today, but really seeing results. This is just a couple of my favorites that we won't go too in depth about each of these today, but a couple of my different favorite case studies that I want to include in here from global medical device company, a prototype tool, 67% less cost, 60% less time. A global appliance manufacturer, this is a dishwasher component, 67% less cost, 71% less time. And then this is really our favorite durability case study is from Tessie Plastics, 60% less cost and over 3.3 million cycles on these deodorant components. The first case study we're going to look at of a company that's doing this and is using metal 3D printing to help them accelerate product development is this prototype tool for this large medical device OEM, which unfortunately we can't disclose who they are to you, but we can talk about this application that they're doing with their printer. They had a new product they were bringing to market that they needed to mold some parts in acetal and radel. Both of those materials would require them to use steel tooling. So very, very early on, they acknowledged, okay, when we want to go validate the function of these components and we want to actually validate our process here as well, we're going to need steel tools, which of course leads to a lot of cost and a lot of lead time. So they're always looking for a better way to do that. They were told the radel was molding at 38,000 psi with high melt temperatures and mold temperatures, and then the acetal was emitting some corrosion gas, which made aluminum tooling not an option here for this prototyping stage. They also wanted to use production materials for their tooling because this was going to allow them to get through both initial prototyping and some of the late stage trials that were going to need to happen because they were using a production representative or production equivalent tool early in the prototyping stage. They're able to use those same parts, which they wouldn't have been able to do if they had machined those parts or if they had used an aluminum prototype. What they did is they used their mantle system, printed these tools in actually our P2X material, which is our P20 equivalent material, 62 hours of printing, 36 hours of sintering here. There was 24 hours of finishing time required. They had to add the ejector pins, which they did via wire EDM. They tapped the mounting holes to mount this thing actually into the mold base, and then they ground it a little bit as well to fit it into the mold base. So all in all, they were able to produce P20 tool steel mold in just 8 calendar days, which is pretty incredible when you think about, it's not uncommon to wait 8 calendar days to get your parts from Protolabs or a machine shop or from an aluminum tool, but we're getting tool steel mold in just 8 calendar days. It was 122 hours of total fabrication, but important to know, only 24 of those hours was actually active hours. The printing and the sintering, of course, is just set it and forget it. That's going to run over the weekend. It's going to run while you're in meetings whenever you want. So 24 hours of active finishing here. Some of the key metrics for this company, they were able to reduce the lead time here from 7 weeks down to 8 days. They said they would have had to outsource this tooling, would have taken them 7 weeks to produce that, but now they're able to do it in-house in just 8 days. The amount of active work from tool making from 148 hours down to just 24 hours. So obviously you can already see how this is clearly accelerating their product development to be able to get functional end-use parts in just 8 days out of a tool steel tool. They also saw a 50% reduced cost compared to outsourcing this tool, and the entire tool was accurate within a thou without any additional finishing. The molding surfaces, this is important to know, the molding surfaces here were left as printed. Our tools kind of generally see a D2 surface finish similar to a Sinker EDM process. So for this application, that kind of matte surface finish was totally fine. So they're able to leave that all as printed, and the molded parts passed all visual and dimensional inspections, which was great. They molded a couple 100 parts here, which was awesome. How do they actually remove all this tool making time and all this tool making cost? By removing a lot of the active work involved. As you can see on that top, if you're familiar with tool making, a lot of different steps are involved in building this part, from the actual cam work, the rough milling, the wire EDM, the electrode milling design and production is always a very, very time consuming step. And then of course, all the EDM work that would been involved to sinker out these deep features. They estimated that was going to take 148 hours of their toolmaker time. With Mantle, they simply printed it, did their wire EDM, did a little bit of final finishing, and down to just 24 hours. But really, the big difference here is in the calendar time, from 7 weeks of calendar time down to just 8 days of calendar time, which allowed them to dramatically accelerate their time to market because they have end-use parts that they're moving into. They're giving to their engineers for prototyping. They're using it for trials, and they're able to get those end-use parts very, very quickly. What's even greater now is that they can use these tools to run thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of parts because they are a tool steel tool that they can use in production. Another great example is from Hypertherm here. You can see this is actually, I have the part here with me today. This is used as a shield cap for their plasma cutter. Hypertherm makes a variety of different torch components, plasma cutters, water cutters, all sorts of these different components. So this was a new shield design that they were testing. It's part of an assembly, obviously. This is sort of the cap that helps protect the torch, I believe. This is actually made out of a 30% glass-filled PEEK. This thing is incredibly stiff, as you can imagine what 30% glass-filled PEEK feels like. So it has a high melt temperature as well as a high mold temperature. So right away they knew using an aluminum tool is not going to be an option here. Since it's a glass-filled material, we're not going to be able to machine it because the properties are going to be quite different, that they knew from the start we're going to need to use a tool steel tool during our development and prototyping stage here. What happened? They worked, with Mantle here. This is actually a slide component that we can print. This is a relatively big part, I would say, for us, but you can see this is a slide that was used to you can see here, obviously it doesn't fit perfectly because the part shrinks after it comes out, but the slide for making the outside of this component, this was printed in our H13 tool steel, which gave it that hardness needed for the glass filled material, as well as that high temperature cycling that you were going to see during this molding process. This part was printed in 129 hours, so about 5 days here, sintered for 36 hours. After it was done through the sintering process, they had to do some wire EDM for a taper that's on the side of this, as well as they ground it to fit it into the mold base. But after all that was done, they had H13 tool steel tooling in just 2 weeks, which of course is, if you're familiar with tool steel tooling, very, very fast process here to get them these, the slide in just 2 weeks here. What are some of the key metrics here? They saw a 75% lead time reduction on this tool compared to outsourcing it. Again, they would have had to outsource this tool to be purchased. This is pretty heavy. I'm going to put it down. I'm getting tired. But a 75% lead time reduction compared to outsourcing it. 75% cost reduction as well by producing this with Mantle's technology. Again, the printed part detail was used with no additional finishing. They used all of this part detail as printed, and then they molded this 30% glass-filled PEEK at that high temperature and high mold temperature as well. And they saw, the parts came out and met their expectations. It's a nice part here. And then you can see, actually in the molding process here, molding those housings. Awesome. So how was Hypertherm able to reduce the tool making time here? With the conventional process, they were looking at 8-week process because of all the different processes that were involved here. A lot of EDM work would have been involved to produce these fine features for these different thread components that are on the outside of this part. With Mantle, they were able to remove all the EDM work except for the one taper wire EDM step and just print all those features in as well. Being able to leave them as printed was awesome for them because they were able to just take the most time-consuming process and remove it. So for them, 8-week lead time down to 2 weeks, so they're saving 6 weeks of development time here, able to test and validate the part much, much, much faster. And of course, since it is an H13 tool, they can use this to run as many as they want. They can move to production with this. While they wait for a high cavity tool or something like that, they can bridge, or they can just go to volume with a tool like this. So 8 weeks to 2 weeks, critical testing and manufacturing validation much, much earlier on, and they're validating the process in the same time. They're going to be able to know that this PEEK is molding to their properties. They're able to look at the temperatures, pressures, shrink rates, and dial all that in during this prototyping stage and not have to worry about that when they get to production, which can commonly slow down actual production manufacturing. Another great example here is this slam latch from our customer Nicolet Plastics. Nicolet Plastics is a injection molder in Wisconsin, so a little bit different. They're not an OEM. We looked at 2 different OEM examples, but we actually see plastic processors using Mantle's technology to help their customers accelerate product development and get involved with their customers earlier on in the development stage. This component here is a actual slam latch. It's used for docking laptops and iPads in emergency vehicles. If you've ever seen, driving by a police officer and they have their laptop kind of docked on their dashboard, uh, this is one of the components inside of that docking station to allow that to happen. For their customer, Gamber Johnson, being first to market is critically important in this accessory market, because whoever is the first to market generally captures most of the market share. When a new iPad model comes out or a new laptop model comes out, there needs to be a new accessory to mount that to the dashboard, and being that first accessory on the market is critically important to them. So they're looking for the fastest way to get these products to market. This again was molded out of a 35% glass filled nylon, so a relatively abrasive material, which would not have been they would not have wanted to mold this with aluminum in the prototyping stage, and they would not have wanted to machine it because they would have been cutting those fibers and they would have seen a different part properties. What do? They actually printed 3 different inserts here. I really like this tool because it's a really good representation of what Mantle's best at, which is eliminating sinker EDM work. As you can see, in all these different features on this part here would have required pretty extensive sinker EDM work, because there's a lot of deep, thin ribs that would have required a lot of different electrode burning here. Of course, with Mantle, we're able to just print all those features just in. They printed 3 different inserts here, actually, the core, the cavity, and there's another insert that goes inside of this hole here that's used for the venting process. They had to insert this as well, but they printed all 3 of those in about 150 hours, so about 7 days here. All 3 of them went in the furnace at the same time for about 36 hours. They only needed to do about 10 hours of finishing work here. They did some wire EDM just on those ejector pins. You can see we're able to print those ejector starting holes in. I don't know how well it comes across on my camera, but there's some really small holes in here that you print in a starter hole, then they just wire them out just because of just how precise those need to be. And then they did a little bit of grinding to fit this into the mold base. So the result was H13 tool steel mold for them in just 2 weeks, and they're able to produce that internally. Nicolay really likes to say that they're able to produce production tooling and prototype timing. They can offer to their customer a 2-week H13 tool, which is really something that most of their competitors are not able to do, and allows them to win a lot of this business, like from Gamber Johnson. So some of the key results here, lead time reduced from 6 weeks down to 2 weeks. The traditional mold building time reduced from 180 hours, they estimated, because of all the sinker EDM work that was required, down to just 12 hours. Molded this 35% glass filled nylon, and then the printed tool was used again with no post-processing to that feature detail that you're seeing up there, which is really, really important. They were fine with that matte finish that you see on this part, and that was totally fine for this actual process. So again, these charts are probably starting to all look pretty similar. We're removing all those time-consuming and expensive steps of the tool building process. We're removing all that EDM work. We're just printing, doing a little bit of final finishing, allowing them to go from a 6-week lead time down to just 2 weeks, allowing their customer to get to market much, much faster, which is really, really important for them. And it's a new service they can actually offer to their OEM customers to allow them to offer this production tooling and prototype timing. One more quick example here before we wrap up and take some questions. I appreciate you guys all joining me today for this relatively quick webinar, but hopefully it was valuable. This is a prototype blow mold actually for PepsiCo. Worked with Westminster Tool on producing this component. I have a version of it here. You can see this is a blow mold component. So molding the bottom of the tool. Blow molding is a really cool process. And this actually incorporated a conformal cooling channel as well to alleviate some of the challenges they were having with their prototype tooling and some of the thermal properties of the prototype tooling materials. They were able to go in just 9 days from the design to the completion of the tool. They did use some conformal cooling here to help them remove some heat blushing they were seeing on the plastic, and then lengthen that tool life to last well over 10,000 shots for different prototype bottles they were building. The part required some pretty minimal machining. They ground the top and the bottom just to make sure it was perfectly flush with the rest of the tool. And then they did some hard milling to the OD base and O-ring just to ensure it all, there was no leaking or anything like that. So 9 days for design to completion for an H13 tool steel blow mold, pretty fast process, of course, and they're able to run tens of thousands of shots with this with really no challenge, as well as alleviate some of the challenges they were having with heat blushing on the prototype tooling materials. So this is always another great example that we like to showcase. Awesome. I'll go ahead and just wrap up quickly. some of the benefits of using steel tooling early in development. Of course, steel tooling is very, very difficult to produce, so it's not common to be used early in development. But with metal 3D printing and Mantle's technology, people are starting to use it much, much earlier on, which is paying a lot of dividends. From the very, very beginning, you're using your end-use plastic material, your end-use resin, your PEEK, your nylons, your glass-filled materials early on in the process, as well as using your end-use manufacturing process to produce true production equivalent parts, which helps you just kind of de-risk the entire product development process because you're getting a part that is identical to what you're going to go to volume with, and you're also using a manufacturing process that you're testing out and ensuring is proper before moving to volume production. You can use those steel tools for your part certification and trials. You're validating that manufacturing process, both the functionality of the mold, which is very, very important to make sure the mold's functioning and you're getting the parts you want, as well as to optimize those molding process parameters, things like temperatures, pressures, cooling rates, and flow rates, cycle times, and shrink rates, as well as doing that molding dimensional analysis to ensure these parts are coming out of your tool with the properties and the tolerances that you want. Of course, an added benefit here is these steel tools can then be used to bridge or actually in volume production. So maybe you need to go buy a 16 or 64 cavity tool while you're waiting your 12 or 16 months to get that tool back from wherever you purchased it from. You can run million shots on your H13 tool and bridge into production there. And ultimately, you're really just de-risking your entire production process here. So thanks. I appreciate you taking some time to join me today for this relatively quick webinar. I will certainly send out a copy of the slides as well as a recording. You can feel free to email me at any time if you have any questions, thoughts, or comments, or you're looking to evaluate Mantle's technology. I really appreciate you joining me today. I'll go ahead and take a look at some of the questions and see